Hello, this is Chelsea with my third presentation on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So some of the objectives I will be covering today are patterns of overexploitation, overexploited resources, species-level conservation, and the species-level conservation of queen conch, and site-level conservation and how marine zoning fits into this. Humans have a history of overexploiting prey populations dating back to prehistoric times. Humans have caused many extinctions when they have spread into parts of the world that have never been inhabited before. Another cause of extinction is the rise of sport hunting, and a great example of this is with the great auk. This bird became extinct in the 1800s due to being overexploited for its meat and feathers. These patterns aren't only seen in animals, but also in plant life. Deforestation is a pattern that causes extinction, and even today, overexploitation is happening and more species are going extinct. Although not all uses of resources are negative. Consumptive users are instrumental for conservation because these users raise the value of wildlife, which fuels conservation. They raise the value of wildlife by assigning a social, cultural, or economic value to a resource. And when people give value to these species, this gives people a reason to support conservation because they want to continue being able to use these resources. So an overexploited resource around the world are fish. Overfishing can cause damage to marine ecosystems and altering ecosystem structure. When fishing, many people aim to capture the largest fish because they're the most profitable and because they meet minimum size limits. By capturing these large fish, there is an issue caused called fishing down. This pattern of overfishing leads to depletion of apex predators and a decrease in total biomass over time. The cascading effects of decreasing population sizes of predator fish species include an increase in herbivorous fish species, which can cause a decrease in plant biomass because there are no predators to keep herbivorous species in check. And this all just really throws off the balance of the ecosystem. The upper Florida Keys have been impacted by fishing down, and they now have a lower biodiversity of species, and the fish that are there are smaller in size. In the waters surrounding Florida, fishing is a large industry which plays an important part in Florida's economy. In South Florida, commercial fishing is the fourth largest industry. Hogfish are an important part in the Florida marine ecosystem, as well as the Florida economy, and they've been overfished. To address this, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has lowered the bag limit of hogfish, set a recreational harvest system, and increased the minimum size limit with the hopes that these measures will help to rebuild the stock. By increasing the minimum size limit, this allows for the biomass of this fish population to increase and lessen the effects of fishing down. Because fishing is such a large part of the Florida economy, people have made conservation of fish stocks more of a priority in order to secure more economic security. This is a great example of how consumptive users are important for conservation, as I mentioned earlier. People who depend on these fisheries economically are motivated to implement conservation so they can continue to profit and maintain their businesses. So moving on to species-level conservation. This is a conservation tactic that focuses on each individual species and the status of that species rather than taking into account an entire ecosystem. The goal of species-level conservation is to prevent the extinction of an individual species, and the status of each species and its level of vulnerability is measured through the IUCN's Red List. On this list, categories of risk are varied from least concern to extinct. By evaluating each species this way, we're able to see what species are at greater risk and prioritize conservation of those species. So an example of species-level conservation in the Florida Keys is with the queen conch. The IUCN does not have enough data to classify the protected status of this species, but it does recognize a decrease in population size over time. Queen conch are protected in Florida through the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and this commission recognizes queen conch as a threatened species in the Florida Keys area. A decrease in population size is due to harvesting pressure as well as water quality, Queen conch are sensitive to changes in the water, and they're used as an indicator species to see what the water quality is. And the water in the Florida Keys area, the quality has decreased, which causes these populations to decrease too. Conservation planning for the queen conch combine continuous tracking of queen conch populations, investing more energy into research of what limiting factors of reproduction and survival there are, a ban on harvesting, and marine zoning, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. The Conch Reef Sanctuary Preservation Area within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is an area which prohibits activities that could be harmful to queen conch, like fishing, anchoring, and discharging pollution. So on a larger scale, there is site-level conservation. And this is conservation that is focused on prevention of habitat destruction in order to maintain biodiversity. Because habitat destruction is a large cause of loss of biodiversity, focusing on the habitat destruction of one site can be really effective at preventing a loss of biodiversity. With this approach, conservation of species don't have to happen one species at a time, and many different species can be conserved at once. A big idea behind site-level conservation is that habitat is the most important thing in conservation of other species. So by focusing efforts on conserving habitats, many species will benefit. So the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary really embodies the ideas of site-level conservation. The purpose of the sanctuary is to provide protected habitat in order to conserve species, especially threatened or endangered species. The marine sanctuary is home to a variety of different threatened and endangered species like corals, seagrass, sea turtles, manatees, egrets, queen conch, and many other species. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary uses marine zoning as its main management strategy. Marine zoning is a conservation strategy that sections off areas into different zones based off of the importance and level of damage of each section. The sanctuary has created 5 different zones that each section can be assigned to. These zones are ecological reserves, sanctuary preservation areas, wildlife management areas, existing wildlife management areas, and special use areas. And this is a map that shows where these zones are located. The yellow area is a national wildlife refuge that isn't a part of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, but the coast is co-managed between the refuge and the sanctuary. And so this yellow isn't, the yellow that you see represents some of the areas where these wildlife management areas are, but it's not the entire yellow section. So each zone has different prohibited activities, which are specialized based on the needs of that zone. This helps allow for continued use of the sanctuary by humans, as well as the continued protection of the ecosystem. The largest zone is the ecological reserves, which you can see in pink. These zones are large, contiguous habitats that are important for marine life. Activities that are not allowed in this zone are fishing, touching live or dead coral, anchoring on coral, and discharging any matter except cooling water or engine exhaust. These limitations are specific to that zone in order to ensure that areas that need extra protection get it. Marine zoning is a good management strategy for habitat prevention in an area that has varying conservation needs. The marine sanctuary and other protected sites like it provide vital habitat to species that are at risk and who risk extinction due to habitat loss. And so these are my works cited. And that's all. Thank you.